faith and fellow Muslims, who she says distort Islam. The program is about an hour.
Ranya, most people when they look at you would not think that you're Palestinian, because we have this image that, conjures up in our mind when we think of Palestinians. Tell me a little bit about your story. Where do you come from?
Not only do they not know that I'm Palestinian, often I'm also told you don't look like a Muslim, so it's sort of a double whammy that way. Originally, my father's from Tiberias, and he left around 1948. He came to the States as a 16-year-old in the 1950s and landed in Chicago. Ended up majoring in math and engineering and graduated from University of Illinois, Champaign. My mother is from Ramleh, and she was very young in 1948, and her father was a civil engineer, and he ended up being employed in Kuwait. And so my background, if you will, has my father going back to the oil-rich Gulf states, seeking a job as a young man at around the age of 26, 27, falling in love with my mother, meeting her in Kuwait, starting their family. I also grew up in Dubai, United Arab Emirates.
So they didn't have an arranged. So they didn't have an arranged marriage that most would think of.
It was not at all. In fact, he, as an engineer, a civil engineer, he was working on a road next to her home, and he would watch her going in and out of the house often, and he fell in love with her. So yes, and they were eventually introduced by a mutual friend.
Right. And then you came to America. Obviously, you went to school here. And what was that like? I mean, your whole sort of journey as being a Palestinian, a Muslim, living in America. What was that like?
I permanently arrived at the age of 16, but prior to that, my father had bought a small home in McLean, Virginia, and so I grew up watching reruns of I Love Lucy and I Dream of Jeannie and Father Knows Best. So I was quite familiar with the American experience in terms of its cultural, the cultural aspect of it. When I finally ended up at Georgetown University, I fell in love with the American dream. I fell in love with our founding fathers, because as someone who, as a Palestinian, I never did really enjoy the security of absolute citizenship. So we were very much at the whim of working permits and visas, and so I very much took to heart the values of the American dream and the protection it affords its most recent immigrants, and it's been a love story since.
And then you must have fallen in love with your husband because you married Sammy.
That's true. We fell in love. We first met at the Washington Harbor.
So you weren't arranged to be married either,
No,
right?
no one in my family has really been arranged. It's not a tradition. In fact, none of the women I can identify have ever worn a headscarf. My grandmother wore a bathing suit and swam in Lake Tiberias way back when. And so we come from a long line of progressive Muslim women. Yes.
So I'm trying to do this examination of your life to see, how did you go from being a typical immigrant, coming to this country, going to school, falling in love, having two beautiful children, living in Manhattan, a wonderful life, and then all of a sudden you're writing books. What was the inspiration? What happened?
I was a PhD candidate. I was more political than religious. My interests sort of fell in that field. But I feel like before 9/11, I would call us accidental Muslims, because ultimately I think many of us are perhaps of a certain religion through an accident of birth. And I think what 9/11 did was, and I'm not alone that way, I think it did that to many American Muslims, it sort of forces you to grapple with the notion of what it means to be America. Islam, after all, after 9/11 was on trial. And every talking pundit on TV was an expert suddenly, and you were told that you couldn't be a woman and be a Muslim, and you needed to be liberated from it, that the violence of Islam was inherent to the theology of Islam. So there was a lot coming at me, and As a mother of a toddler at the time and two children, my daughter was starting kindergarten, I very much was worried about the future of my children as American Muslims. And I thought, well, if being Muslim is just a label, or it's something that we are as a family because of a sort of ancestral loyalty, then why put them through that challenge? It had to be more, and hence the beginning of this journey.
So the terrorists blow up two beautiful buildings in our city, our state, our country. And what is the impact on a person like you who's living a comfortable life in Manhattan? What impact does that have on you, and what do you think about those people? For the audience that is listening who barely ever get to hear from people like you, would you tell us what you think of these terrorists and how you think that they have affected your life?
Well, first and foremost, they affected the life of people they took away so savagely that day. From my perspective, my own personal perspective, coming at it from a Muslim, the pain of those lost to the terror that day, the mourning that we were all doing together, is compounded by another challenge, which is, by virtue of calling ourselves Muslim, we were guilty by association. And so that was heart-wrenchingly difficult, and as a mother, even more so, as you grapple with trying to make sense of it all for two very innocent children.
Yeah, your son was what, Taimur?
Yeah, he was only 3, and my daughter was just beginning kindergarten. And I remember, sadly, that her first day at school was actually the morning of 9/11, the first official day of kindergarten. And I read about this in the book, where I packed a teeny miniature Quran in her backpack as a sort of a spiritual talismanic kind of protect my daughter thing.
So that's like Christians carrying a cross.
It is, yes.
Sort of for protection.
And it was a big, oversized backpack with a teeny tiny Quran. And as I watched the images of the horror of that day, of the buildings going up with flames, and thinking that the very same miniature Quran that had packed so lovingly in my daughter's backpack was being used to wreak the havoc and the hate and the destruction.
Yes.
And the juxtaposition of those two realities was mind-numbing and confusing at a very existential level, as a parenting at a parenting level. And so the journey has been for me a journey of learning and of owning my religion, of understanding the issues, and empowering my children. We can teach our children as American Muslim parents to disassociate, disengage, and say, and I'm told this is also true to the Jewish experience, when you have stereotypes out there and you're trying to develop your identity in opposition to a stereotype, you can sort of say, well, you know, I'm not quite Muslim, or I'm not quite,
people are changing names right now. There's a lot of, people are shying away from celebrating or doing Ramadan in the office. People are, closing up their identities.
And that's a natural reaction. It's a very difficult journey, but it's one that I hope, and I do not know that I have made the right choice, but I think I have. I do feel like by taking my children along on this journey and insisting that they, not insist, because ultimately the choice is theirs. What I do is reveal. I take them along as we learn together. And slowly they have chosen to self-identify as Muslims too. And I think that by doing that, I hope that they can hold both America accountable to its higher ideals, as they can hold Islam accountable to its higher ideals, that they become living embodiments of what it means to be truly American and Muslim, and they can be agents of change for a better world.
Well, I find it extremely profound that you chose to do this with your life. because many people, there are two types of people of conscience who actually take it upon themselves to create a change. And you have not only written a prior book called The Faith Club, which was very popular all over the United States. I remember every time I go lecture, there's always some little old lady who comes out and says, The Faith Club, I think you were mentioned in The Faith Club. So now that was one book that you wrote about 3 women coming together to explore their faiths, and now you've written this new book, which is sort of more like Muslims sort of self-examining. And I love the title of the book. I mean, Burqas, baseball, and apple pie. When I got this and I said, what is she trying to say? So tell us, what are you trying to convey through this book to the Americans who are listening to you right now?
Some people took issue with the title because they thought that somehow having
the burqas are going to come to New York?
That somehow the burqa would kind of compound the stereotype that Islam is about burqas. I think it's catchy. I like the way it sounds. Truth of the matter is that in the book I just speak about all those elements.
Yeah.
And if burqas is a metaphor for what people may associate with Islam positively or negatively, then it's something that it's an issue that I deal with in. And you're right in saying that my journey started way back with the Faith Club, and the Faith Club became just such a gift for me, a blessing, because it took me all over the country, from the mountains of Boise, Idaho, to the shores of Jacksonville, Florida, and I fell in love with America all over again, and America became virtually a faith club to me. And people are so eager to learn. Most people do not have the opportunity to meet a Muslim in person. They only have the headline news to go by, or they don't have a neighbor who's a Muslim. And so it was just such a gift. And book 2, which is the one,
yes,
Burqas,
baseball, and apple pie,
is definitely a journey in which I have taken the mirror and held it up as a Muslim from within. I've taken on issues that I think will be challenging for my children as they mature as self-identifying American Muslims. So I didn't want the issues just be ones that are Islam and the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Abrahamic faith, which was part 1, but rather this is part 2, which is a continuation of the journey that I had started.
Well, as I was reading it, I saw it 2 ways. I saw it as trying to take back the soul of Islam, but also to take back the soul of the United States. Because there are some profound things that have happened in this book that you talk about, certain experiences with your children that have propelled your children to take action, propelled you to take action. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. We'll go into details, but there's something that you mentioned in the book. You talk about you suffer from church and temple envy. Explain that to me. I'm very curious what you mean by that.
That's a difficult one, but yes, I at the time when I made that statement, I still feel it today. Of course, I had Priscilla and Suzanne, who were members of their respective temples and churches, and in times of pain and distress, they had the solace of a community, of a place to worship, a place to have their children be introduced to the fundamentals of their religion, or a place to just celebrate holidays, come together as a community to affirm their identity and as part of a community of faithful, of spiritual people. And yes, there are mosques in New York City. It's just to understand my envy, you have to understand that we are definitely secular Muslims. We're progressive Muslims. So I needed a place of worship where we didn't sort of stick out as a sore thumb. We are, after all, first and foremost Americans. And I think that the larger
So you want
mosques,
an institution that values the essentials of your faith, but also have a cultural expression.
And also my
which is
experience. We're not the most recent of immigrants, and so, and you know, and it's and yes, a place where just
So the equivalent of a JCC or a YMCA.
That's right. Yes.
So let's go to that specific thing that you mentioned in the book, which I found to be really moving. You talk about the experience of the community center downtown, which I was involved with. So for full disclosure to the audience, and you were asked to come to the community board meeting, and then describe the feeling that you left with that day, of what you saw in the room. And here you were, an integrated American, standing up there knowing that your children needed a home and you were coming to speak about it. What did you leave with that day? And describe that scene that you describe in this book with a man blowing the shofar. I would love for you to tell this audience that are listening to you right now, what was that feeling like?
It was rattling. It was tangible vilification, I think. To be on the receiving end of that type of emotion is never a pleasant experience. What was going through my head was, oh my goodness, we're not the only community to have experienced these feelings of intense negative stereotyping and vilification. I mean, the Jews before us and other minorities have had that, and I really felt I couldn't help but take it personally. It's a scary feeling, and yes, I'm very assimilated. We don't wear outward symbols of our faith, so there's no reason why I would be identified on the street that way. But yes, I experienced something that was rather raw and intense, which I hadn't before.
Yeah. Well, you then say that you felt that your children prematurely were thrown into the inferno of Islamophobia, because now you were witnessing like the rise of Islamophobia, with people heckling and saying things like "go home" or "go back to Mecca." I mean, we're not even from Mecca, but yet
yes, I think when people
what was that
do
like
that,
for your children?
It's if we could only just stop, all of us, and consider that there could be a 10-year-old at home being exposed to that, a 10-year-old who has never known a home outside New York City or America, who doesn't carry a passport of any other country, who doesn't have a home to go to other than here. And then when you have those placards and signs saying Muslims go back, or all Muslims are terrorists, or as you described, the heckling, then I think that answers itself. As a mother, one can only be very concerned, and my first reaction is to protect my children, and then the second is to empower them. At the same time, I'm very weary of making them feel like victims, because we're not. We're blessed.
Yeah.
We're lucky to be here.
Yeah.
And that's the promise of America, is that we are protected by its ideals, by our Constitution, and it's our journey to take, a journey that has been very well paved for us by other faith traditions before us. So.
Yeah. So you tell this thing of you're getting up one day, having a cup of coffee in your hand, and you have this Google alert, and there you see your son has now intervened. Tell us that story.
Yes, it was at the time the height of the controversy, the downtown mosque controversy, and I woke up, and when I first thing I do is check my emails, and there was the results of a Google search for "why I hate Muslims," and so you can imagine the hateful sites that were out there. And then I turned to reprimand my son, and I'm upset with what I think may be sort of an introduction to language that he shouldn't be exposed to, being as young as he was at the time. And as if to sort of allay my fears, he said, Mommy, but I wrote something. And he did. He wrote something rather impressive for a young man his age, a young boy his age, actually. So I don't remember the exact words, but I think they were to the effect of, we shouldn't blame Muslims, just as we don't blame Jews for the death of Jesus, just as we don't blame, I think, Hitler and Christians for the Holocaust.
For the Holocaust. Yes. That's very profound for those people who do not know what this little Timur looks like. That is your beautiful son Timur, who goes to a very nice school.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, in some ways, I'm thinking that perhaps maybe you wrote this book for your children. For the sake of your children.
I did.
And for all
They've
those
yet
other
to read
parents.
it, of course. They're like most teenagers and young teen my son is today. And but yes, I do feel like this is something I leave behind for them.
Well, and then there's a story about your daughter who also, I mean, not only your son, but your daughter also got involved in this, and she was a very young girl. And you talk about your daughter's project called It's Okay. It's an okay assignment, right? Tell us a little bit about that assignment. And
that was way back when she was actually just in first grade, and it was a moment of awareness as a mother and as a Muslim, as an American Muslim, that even if I chose to ignore Islam, it wouldn't choose to ignore us. That's because she goes to a wonderful school, but she was at the time only one of 40 girls who identified as a Muslim, and so the project was it's okay ... and so it could be it's okay to be afraid of the dark, it's okay to bite your nails, and in her case, and she was only I think 7 or 8 at the time, if not younger, and she said it's okay to be Muslim when everyone around you is Jewish and Christian.
So were you surprised that she chose that?
I
mean,
was.
do you think that your children were internalizing what was going on?
Of course, and I think that, you know, that's the biggest challenge is for American Muslims to find their place, to find their voice, to assimilate in a healthy, cohesive, empowering, energized way, and to be positive contributors to the community, to the wider community, and that's a little bit more challenging for Muslims these days.
Yeah, perhaps the people who were behind the Islamophobic rhetoric do not realize the impact on children. You know, although they think they're opposing something, but they don't realize how much little children internalize this. It may not be outward bullying, but really they internalize even speech, because, you know,
this is true, and you know,
the tongue is sometimes sharper than the pen, as we know.
And from my experience, you know, those fears are real. I understand why many Americans would be afraid or would fear the idea that, you know, Islam, if one were to understand Islam as being Al-Qaeda or the jihadists, then of course you would be afraid. But the truth of the matter, and this is what is incumbent upon us as American Muslims to communicate, is that those are not the values of Islam, clearly. They're not what Islam was ever meant to be. And so I think that fear is an equal opportunity actor. It's real to those who vilify, but I don't think the reaction should be vilification. I think it's much more American for us to learn and to seek truth, and I think it's our duty as American Muslims to be there to provide that truth. And
I agree with you. I think that it's very important for us to remove the ignorance, because ignorance is the greatest danger to us all. So now that you've written this book, Ranya, what advice do you give other parents who, you know, I'm sure they'll get lots of ideas from your book, but what advice do you give Muslim parents? But also, I would like you to advise parents of Hindu children and Sikh children who are also minorities in their own faiths. They don't have the majority religion in their, you know, where they are part of that. They are not even part of a monotheistic tradition, and this is something I'm very sensitive to, because oftentimes Hindu people say, well, we're not even part of the Abrahamic tradition, so we feel left out. What advice do you have for all these minority religions that are now sort of arrived in America and are here, and their parents, and what should they do with their children?
Yes, that's a big one to chew on, but I think that I'll just speak from my experience. I think that it's very important to not feel, again, I've said this, as if we are victims, because we are truly blessed. Many of us arrive at the shores of this great country because we escape discrimination or war or conflict, or we seek refuge, and we appreciate,
we wanted to be part of the American
the American dream, and the opportunities, the land of
Right.
opportunity, and that's America's promise. And many people, its most recent patriots, take it to heart, and it's a promise that means a lot and is very dear to our family. So those words are not vapid. They're values we live by every day: freedom of expression and the freedom to worship. We rely on them as American Muslims for that dignity, for the opportunity to assimilate, for our equality and respect under the law. And that is first and foremost what I teach my children, is this country has been built and is built and continues to thrive on those ideals. And equally so, whether one is from a Muslim background or a Sikh background, those ideals or those values, the synergy is there. No religion is built on hate. It cannot survive. I mean, God's truth is absolute. It is beyond the nuances of the different traditions. Whether we approach God through the rituals of a Sikh or Christianity or Judaism or Islam, it's not the point. Rituals are not values in of themselves. Piety is not morality. Morality is bigger and larger than our various traditions and the diversity within the traditions, but we're all equally on that path to God, that path to truth, that absolute truth that says that we're all equal, we're all loved by God, that diversity must exist. In Islam we say diversity is a sign of divine mercy, and that killing, violence, injustice is absolutely unacceptable, whatever tradition you come from.
So embrace the American ethos of pluralism as much as possible, and engage with the pluralism, and commit to that pluralism. And like you said, pluralism is part of the divine plan. And here we have in America opened up our shores and allowed immigrants to come and nourish it and flourish it, and so allow everyone to be who they are in their uniqueness, but also to be united, to stand.
Well,
united.
It's America's blessing and its legacy and its gift to mankind, I think, that it has figured out a system where these guarantees, these securities are guaranteed for its most diverse, its most recent immigrants and its oldest immigrants. I think our challenge as Muslims in other parts of the world, majority Muslim countries do not have those, and I often feel that we need to rescue God from the hands of the humanities, of humanity, of the abuse of political power, of God is in service of man as opposed to man servicing God in many Muslim majority countries. And fortunately in America we're blessed because we don't have to worry about that, and God is rescued from the vanity of man, and we can thrive as in the beauty of our diversity, all on this journey every day, thriving towards the beauty of God.
So let's go a little deep into this diversity issue. Islam is very diverse in the sense that we have so many nationalities, and Manhattan is unique because Manhattan is home to this entire diversity. Every ethnicity, every nationality, every school of thought that I know of is in Manhattan. So I call this the annual Mecca, year-round. We have Muslims from every conceivable part of the world, in all their shades and in all their colors. So what do you feel when people tell you, because in the book you've mentioned that you're not Muslim enough, or you don't fit that prototype of a Muslim? And I actually started that very provocative question because you look like such an American, so Does it irritate you when Muslims tell you you're not Muslim enough, or you don't fit that image of what people have? The very thing that we fight against, which is that not all Muslims are alike, we tend to impose on our own communities. So talk a little bit about that.
I'd like to start first by pointing out that the tension between orthodoxy and spirituality isn't necessarily just particular to Islam. That tension exists within all faith traditions, where, if you will, the Orthodox feel a certain proprietorship over, or rituals are used to measure one's faith, as in a sort of a yardstick of increased faith, the more religiosity you exhibit. So that is, I think, a feature of many faith traditions. But what is unique about the Muslim experience is that, as you said, within the Muslim tradition, and it's not accidentally so, I think it is intently so, intended by the Wahhabist tradition, there is a belief that to qualify as a Muslim you have to look a certain way, or to wear a scarf a certain way, or to follow the rules, that there is not an acceptance, there isn't this acceptance of the diversity from within. And this is, if I were to identify the singular most important challenge to overcome as Muslims, it would be that the notion that diversity is just as available to Muslims. The truth of the matter is, the reason why we are here today is because of this Wahhabist inclination, which I read somewhere that is not only ahistorical but is actually anti-historical, because it denies centuries of Islamic theology and tradition and plurality, hundreds of years of diversity, and subscribes to the idea that to be a Muslim you have to just follow its edicts from the 7th century and a very limited short period of time. And I think our journey as American Muslims has to be about refusing to being told by clerics who speak for us that Islam in its ideals is a 7th century reality. We are Americans and Muslims who need an Islam of the 21st century. So
in some ways, I've heard many people in the Jewish community say that, you know, they're not practicing Jews, but they're cultural Jews. And they identify with their Jewish identity in a very strong way. So are you also then suggesting that there are Muslims who may not be necessarily devout, may not be practicing all the 5 pillars? They might only practice one pillar, like, you know, giving charity or belief in God, and not necessarily going to Hajj, or not necessarily fasting for an entire month, but maybe sort of dabbling in certain those pillars occasionally, but not 100%. Then you're saying that type of Muslim is
those
as
are the
authentic
majority
as every other Muslim.
I think there's a statistic, and I mention it in the book, which is research done by Tariq Ramadan in Europe, which shows that 90% of Muslims actually do not adhere to the exact rituals and demands of their religion. So that would negate 90% of Muslims from Islam. Absolutely, it's just a reality, it's a fact on the ground. And we don't go around questioning Christians or Jews or Sikhs, for that matter, if rituals are not, if they choose to self-identify as the faith they want to be in, so be it. Ultimately, it's between them and God, and no more. And so much more in the case of Muslims, where we don't have an official religious hierarchy. We don't have the equivalent of a pope. We don't even have confirmation rituals, really. So it is very much a religion based on the idea that your faith is between you and God.
And your Creator.
And I'm very spiritual. I take a lot of solace in my religion and my faith. And I seek it. I'm inspired by it. Sometimes I do most of my writing at 5 in the morning, and I like to think that that call, the adhan, call to prayer, which happens before sunrise, the first call is wake up and thrive. Wake up and work, basically. Thriving is better than sleep. And if I don't get up to necessarily engage in ritualistic prayer, I still get up and engage in some sort of work. If it's not my work as a writer, maybe it's my work in preparation, maybe even maintaining a healthy body, going out to the park and running, or maybe getting in, preparing for a meal that evening for my children. I know so many mothers do that. So I think if faith lived in action and practiced in life personally speaks to me. But that's my choice, and I respect other people's choices.
Yes, but actually God says in the Quran that, you know, he who believes in God, not he, meaning he, she, human beings who believes in God and does good deeds, has nothing to fear. So salvation is really in believing, like the connection that you have, and also doing good deeds. So doing as much good as you can for humankind, serving God through serving humanity, is really your way to securing that place which will be, you know, which we call as heaven or paradise. But you talk about your confrontation with a woman in your book about an event, Who Speaks for Islam. You mentioned an encounter where she interpreted her definition of modesty differently than yours, and if you can just illuminate a little bit about that experience.
I think we were in Virginia at the time, and I was expanding on the idea that there's no one meaning to veil. Sometimes veils are taken up as a statement of opposition. Sometimes a veil can be liberating, because if you are in a conservative society that won't allow you to enter a mosque or interpret the Quran or study or go to school unless you wear one, then you do it because it enables you to take that path of empowerment. Sometimes it can just be a very sort of akin to the experience of a nun, where you are seeking salvation, or you've had a sort of a schismatic experience in your life where you're seeking solace out of a more spiritual, modest practice of life. So there are many, many interpretations to the veil. And I think the thing that got to her was, I said, and it's not mentioned in the Quran, which I know it isn't, it says, take your khumar and cover your bosoms. And she very much took issue with that and sought me out after the presentation and said to me, how can you call yourself a Muslim? The 5 pillars of Islam is what the house is built on, and if you do not engage in them, then you are a weak Muslim, and yes, the veiling is very much required. You know, that's the beauty of being in America. We have a freedom of choice, and it's her choice, but I feel that my journey has been about feeling that I'm equally Muslim, that there is room for me as a Muslim within Islam, that there are many progressive voices out there who are also on the same journey, who are scholars and academics who are writing about it, and that diversity is a natural development within the faith.
So, so I mean, of course, there is no such thing as a lesser Muslim in the eyes of God. You know, in the eyes of God, a Muslim is one who submits to the will of God. And then all of how we practice and how we are judged is really not up to another human being. And so I'm surprised that this devout woman came up to you and said that you know, judged you on that basis. A lot of people have been saying that, you know, that there are no moderate Muslims anywhere. Where are they? That's what we hear from that continuous refrain from Americans. Where are the moderate Muslims? Do you consider yourself to be a moderate Muslim? And if you do, how do you define that?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I have to make a confession. When I was on the road, it was singularly the most frequently asked question. It was always, so where are the moderates? And at the time, I became a little disdainful of it, a little sort of rolling my eyes. Well, we're 1.6 billion of us. We're your teachers, we're your nurses, your doctors, we're everywhere. You know, just because a mother gets up in the morning and prepares breakfast for her children doesn't make our headline news. And so what do you mean, where are the moderates? And I worried that somehow within the question were seeds of prejudice, that somehow I was an aberration, an exception, and an atypical Muslim. So I was a little dismissive. And then after book 2, when I got home and there were no more speaking engagements, and I got home one day and I had the NPR radio on, and at the time it was a report of a Somali girl named Aisha, who was being stoned to death. Well, she was killed through stoning. She went in to report her rape, and as a consequence, they accused her of adultery and proceeded to stone her to death. I broke down in tears, and I think suddenly I felt like I had developed a new pair of ears, a set of ears, and I heard the question where the moderates in a very different way, meaning that as a Muslim, I needed more than just justifying that act as if, which it is, an aberration and specific to the conditions, anarchic conditions within Somalia. I needed more than that. I needed to have absolute Muslim positions that would relegate these awful practices to a time and age that doesn't belong to today. So we certainly have our work cut out for us, I think, as Muslims, and we do need to demand those zero. I know people feel it. I know no one who's sane believes there should be stoning or amputations or flogging in today's world. And the irony of it, and the thing that confuses me and I do not understand, is I don't understand why some Muslims have chosen, to make that the be-it and all, the ethos of Islam, because stoning wasn't invented by Muslims. It was just as much a Jewish tradition, and so we do need to articulate very clear, definitive positions.
Well, the fact that you're a Muslim woman and you have taken upon yourself to educate the public and to help guide Muslim parents is an indication that Muslim women are, in the front lines. Recently we have seen Muslim women in Tahrir Square, in all the squares all over the Middle East, very much part of the, pro-democracy, freedom movements, and challenging the status quo. So, it's frustrating as a Muslim woman when you know that Islam has granted Muslim women all these rights 1400 years ago, and yet we, in some parts of the world, there has been so much regression of all those God-given rights have been taken away from man. If it were up to you and you had all the resources in the world, what would you do to change that? You've already done a lot.
Yes, I think that first and foremost is education and enlightenment. It's a sad indication of where we are as Muslims that the first word in the Quran, the first is read, of course, often translated as recite. Blind recitations with no clear understanding. Read, of course, is for me the truth of the better translation, because it's iqra, which in Arabic is to read, and to read is to think, to critically think, to not just be blindly following, and to think is to take the Prophet's life and to put it in the context of his time, and to understand that he was first and foremost a feminist, a maverick, a progressive, who very much in his first marriage chose a businesswoman, his boss, as Imam Faisal reminds us all the time, that she proposed to him in marriage. How revolutionary is that?
And she was 40 and he was only 25.
And yes, an older woman.
Yeah.
And then we have, of course, other women he married who, Aisha, I think, is the first Muslim lawyer and is a great, I think she has contributed the most to the tradition of Sharia, not the Sharia, the Hadith, the prophetic sayings. And she, in her time, was consulted over matters of legal issues in the community and jurisprudence. She was also a military leader. And so it's bizarre to me that women are banned from driving, for instance, when we have these illustrious, incredible role models for women within our own faith tradition. So it definitely goes back to education, and I think that would be the first the first step.
It's interesting that you say that the Prophet was a feminist, because I remember meeting Gloria Steinem once, and she came to me, she says, your Prophet was a feminist. And I said, yes, we know that. I mean, feminist in the sense that he was surrounded by women and gave women, he regarded women. If a woman walked into the room, he would take out his cloak and put it down so that she could sit in a clean space. He was very respectful of women. And so, yes, education is the key in creating awareness all over the world. But there's a lot of confusion in America about Sharia. And I know that you have spent some time in your book talking about what it really means. Can you explain to the American audience what is really Sharia versus what proponents of Islamophobia have been saying it is?
First, I'm not an expert, obviously, in Sharia, but
from your perspective.
From my perspective, and one of the most, for me, beautiful revelations that happened while I was doing research for the book is that I found out that Sharia literally means the path to the watering hole. That's the path to salvation. If you imagine that the Quran came down in the desert, where water was the most valuable resource, it's the difference between life and death. And so the path to the watering hole is the path to our salvation. And Sharia isn't something that is static, it's not dead, it's very much alive. And in fact, all religions have to be, all faith traditions have to be current, alive, and on a journey where otherwise they become archaic and stale. So
irrelevant.
And irrelevant. And that's unfortunately my fear for Islam, if the more orthodox sort of Wahhabist strand continues to speak on its behalf. And so Sharia, it's the equivalent of halakha law. It's not, and certainly we all know that in America we're not about to replace our separation of church and state or court system. There is no religion, and thankfully so, something that we American Muslims very much appreciate and honor and value. Sharia is frankly irrelevant to my life on a daily basis. Right. So the fact that it was touted and used as this big sort of fear-mongering, one more sort of big scary word, that is definitely something that is confusing, not just to Americans who are not Muslims, but Muslims themselves, and it certainly did elicit many questions on my part as I did my research.
Yeah, Jon Stewart has had a whole segment on Sharia, and he just went around Manhattan and he saw all these little street vendors who sell, halal food, and he said, "Oh, here's Sharia." And then of course people who are praying in Manhattan and all the places of worship, "Oh, here's Sharia." And the truth is that when we practice our religion freely, when we give charity, when we can fast, when we can believe in what we want to believe in, when we can eat the type of food that we want to eat, that's Sharia. So in that respect, Sharia is very much part of the American ethos. Now, you say something in the book about your son. We belong to the Abrahamic faith traditions, and belief in God is essential part of our creed. But in your book, you talk about if your son decided to not be a Muslim anymore, embrace another religion, that would be okay with you.
It's actually, I think, in the context of my. Yeah, it would be. I mean, ultimately, it's a choice. I mean, I don't think that there's no such thing as being forced to stay within a faith tradition. Morality is about choice. If you take away choice, then there's no such thing as forced morality. I mean, who are we tricking? God? I mean, God can see in our hearts and minds. To me, it's counterintuitive. It's irrational. So yes, choice is the essence, freedom is the essence of morality, of virtue.
So you are basically busting that myth that the Islamophobes run around with, saying that if a Muslim converts, he becomes an apostate, and so therefore, his life is at risk. To me, ultimately, if I can just expand on it a little bit, if there's one God and He's created all the religions, and all we do is worship Him instead of in one liturgy, in another liturgy, then there should be no competition between these religions. Is that how you see it?
I actually, one of the reasons I'm a committed Muslim is because I think it's such a modern sensibility, and it has an ecumenical, diverse ethos built into its theology.
Explain that a little bit.
As a Muslim, I am required to believe in Jesus and Moses and 25 other prophets. I'm required to believe in the virgin birth of Mary. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad, according to tradition, doesn't have a unique or special position. We revere them equally. And 5 times a day in prayer, we're supposed to kneel and pray and pray for blessing and peace for the Abrahamic family, that being, of course, of Moses and Jesus and Muhammad.
I think we mentioned Abraham 22 times in our prayers if we do all our five daily prayers.
So that is very much where I find my home within the faith tradition, that it's has a sense of facility and ease with the idea that there are many paths to God, but there's one God and one absolute truth.
So what have we Muslims done wrong where our religion is so tolerant and so embracing? What have we done wrong in not being able to convey that very powerful message that we embedded in our theology is this regard for Christianity and Judaism? What have we done wrong?
We have been living our dark ages in terms of our civilization. We're at the mercy of very repressive, intolerant tendencies within the political system and within the faith tradition, and they have taken the upper hand because of, unfortunately, oil money, overabundance of oil money. And so they've, I think sometimes Muslims, sadly, in some parts of the world, don't recognize their own religion. I've had Muslims ask me, are Sufis Muslim? I mean, that's to me such a pathetic question. It's sad in its level and quality of ignorance. So I think, yes, there's just a whole... we need to go back to our texts. We need to reconnect with our civilization, and within our civilization, within our faith traditions, not even the West's, but our own, within our own theology and the diversity of our theology, we have the answers.
So what does it feel like as a Muslim to watch Muslim killing Muslim and using their own theology to justify those kinds of atrocious suicide bombings and killings? And
it's there's no other word. I'm going to be blunt. It's the most it's disgusting. It's shameful. It brings shame to Islam. It brings shame to me as a Muslim. I take it personally. I, as a mother, try to bring it in a very real way into our home and not distance ourselves from it.
But does your resolve get even stronger that you have to do something about it? I mean, I see your book as that resolve, that
I think the book's been called
piece.
Passionate. And yes, I have a lot of passion because it's coming from a real place of concern, a real place of hurt and frustration, and a real place of enough's enough with this idiocy and lunacy and ignorance. And so yes, I'm sorry if I sound too forthright perhaps, but it is passionate. It's very real. It's very dear. It's very close to my heart as a woman, as a mother, as an American, and as a Muslim.
And this reminds me of the suffragettes, and when they decided that enough was enough, that they were not considered, a full citizen, although the country said all men are equal in the eyes of God or in the eyes of the Constitution, and black men and black women were considered inferior. And it was the suffragette women that were motivated by their faith that said, if God has created everyone in His image, then why is man treating the black man and woman inferior, and woman is inferior? So, in some ways, you are following in the footsteps of the suffragettes. I am a proud inheritor of the suffragette movement, and I know that you are also, going along that same legacy.
Well, I think that when you say inspired by their faith, I think this is something that you bring up that is also very close and dear to my heart. There are many women and men who have spoken up against these issues from within the faith, but they have perhaps identified as agnostics or non-Muslims anymore, or anti-Muslims sometimes. And I come to it from a place of love and respect for my faith, and that's the difference. It's that I have a deep love for Islam and deep respect, and at the same time much frustration and much passion for the need for it to get its act together.
So you're not rebelling against Islam, you're rebelling against the Muslims who have taken Islam.
We haven't done it justice.
For political gain.
We have failed it, yes.
Is there anything you would like to tell your audience that I haven't asked you?
I think my last sentence would be pretty much close to what it's a place of deep fundamental respect for values, for my values that I hold dear, the values as a family we hold dear, which is respect for America's values and Islam's values, and we see no contradiction between the two. And that, unlike my Omaha friend whom I write about in the book, who told me, you are not an American, because I think he at the time was, he said to me, your people are the source of all violence in the world. And that is, and that at the time I thought I would allay his fears, and I said, I'm your people too, I'm an American. And he said to me, oh no, you're not. I'd also like to add that one other sort of pet peeve I have is the idea that Islam is, by definition, the question of, is Islam a violent religion? I take issue with that question, because I think it's one that both sides don't answer well, and it's a very divisive question. It, by definition, puts Muslims on the defensive, and I think, when Muslims insist it's a religion of peace, it's a religion of peace, and the other side says it's a religion of war, it's a religion of war, and I think that it's just it's a futile approach to it. Really, any religion is only as peaceful or as violent as the hands it finds itself in. And if you look at any of our faith traditions, they've all had their moments of peace and they've all had their moments of violence. And Islam is not immune to either. And so I think that that's another point.
So I wanted to thank you very much. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Burqas, baseball, and apple pie. If I were you and you were really trying to understand and educate yourself and remove the ignorance that's out in the world, please buy this book. I highly recommend it. It's an easy read. You can read it over a weekend. And I thank you very much, Ranya, for joining us today.
Daisy, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.